Jeff, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Craig. Really happy to be here.
As we noted in the introduction, you are well known in the sustainable design community for your consulting work and teaching about sustainable building design, and most recently as the Director of Responsible Development at Northcrest Developments. So why don't you tell our listeners how you became interested in sustainability and where does mass timber fit into that interest?
Yeah, thanks, Craig. Um, yeah, I'd say I sort of had an interesting journey into this sustainable development world, uh, and to sort of shortcut that, I really got into the space with a real focus on community building, on how cities work. I graduated from business school. I was immediately involved in some small business startups, really retail centered, neighborhood-based businesses in the service industry, and really seeing how urban communities function, which kind of led me down this path of really getting into cities and how cities work in North America, and the idea of sustainable development, being partly, obviously with the issues of climate change being a technical challenge we need to solve, but that so many of the answers were really about the cities we build and how we shape those. And that set me up really well for getting into the green building space, where I started working around the early days of corporate social responsibility and consulting, working with a number of developers and associations like Sustainable Buildings Canada.
Right, that's where we first met.
Yeah, absolutely. Back in sort of, really 2006, 2007, when the green building movement, when LEED and those kind of programs were just taking off. So really fortunate to be in that place. And I think when you get into mass timber, as a conversation, it comes out of that movement. And I sort of remember those early conversations when I first started. It was still very much an energy conservation lens in the green building space, which seemed incomplete. And we sort of had those rules of thumb. It's like, don't really worry about embodied carbon. That's like 2 years of operation, energy use, emissions and impacts like that. People were saying things like that. And we started to see, that's not quite the case. And we know, in hindsight, how big those impacts are. But when those conversations were just starting to happen, say 10, 12 years ago, of understanding the impacts of materiality on buildings, I think at the same time, the mass timber space was coming out, and there was a ton of buzz, a ton of excitement. And I remember very much when we were programming events, people were so excited to see these first early wood buildings, and just really wrapping their heads around the performance, the sustainability, the aesthetics, the constructability. These are just such intriguing paradigm shifts for people in the design community.
And you've always been about the environment and carbon, but what is it about mass timber itself that you find really compelling?
Well, I think first of all, the thing that stands out obviously when you look at mass timber, it's the beauty of it and the form.
Yeah,
and
that's what attracted me too.
You go into the buildings, the smell and just the qualitative aspects, and
everyone says that, don't they? It is so different.
It's different, and I mean that resonates with people, and maybe that goes back to the aesthetics and the beauty components that are involved with sustainability are really important. People connect to them and they're attractive. So I think that's the first thing that gets people. Obviously finding those synergies between sustainability, between aesthetics and beauty, the fact that it seems well suited to form for the kinds of good urban density that we want to see in cities, I think is really promising. It sort of fits a nice sweet spot. Speed of construction, the fact that it's workable. There's a lot in that story. Hey, we can build faster and more sustainably, and it's beautiful. Like, I think that that certainly piqued my interest.
And now in your role at Northcrest, what does Northcrest Development see for mass timber in its future development plans?
For sure.
Concretize that yet?
Yeah, we'll maybe give you just a bit of an insight into Northcrest. So, fairly recently joined this really interesting development company based out of Toronto, who is predominantly a one project company. We were created to redevelop the Downsview Airport Lands in the north end of Toronto by our parent company, PSP, which is 370 acres in the heart of Ontario,
It's a small
Canada's most.
city.
Yeah, it's a small city. So, transferring an old airplane manufacturing facility and runway into a city for about 80,000 people and 40,000 workers over the next 30 years. So, incredible urban city building, urbanism,
Yeah.
density. And so we are very much looking at, how to build that site out as sustainably as possible and evaluating a number of sites. Now we're sort of pre-building design. We've been focusing on the planning for the last 5 years and are just starting to move into design of our first district, which is one of 7 districts we're going to be building. And so it is very much, obviously we are trying to encapsulate how you build a city in the most sustainable way possible, but also recognizing we're in a market with an incredible housing affordability crisis. We also have labor challenges that we need to address. And we have this really unique scale because we're inheriting some really large industrial lands, employment lands, the airplane hangars, which we are evaluating how we might be able to use those to support our development process. And so, mass timber is one of those technologies right now that's really intriguing to us because of the idea of modularity, the fact that we could also, work on systems that we could deploy at scale on one site in one location. And so a lot of the maybe logistical challenges around modularity are reduced. And so, I'd say it's very early conversations. We haven't decided on technology, but it's very much one of our primary sort of technologies that we're evaluating right now.
Your comment on modularity is a good segue to my next question, which is, what are the most compelling mass timber innovations you're seeing in your work, or out in the market for that matter, innovations that could really move the design and engineering of mass timber forward?
You very much, I think we're looking at technologies that speed up construction practices.
Yeah.
I think that's,
yeah.
And we're so that's a big part of, I think, what we're looking at, the automation of construction, the mass production of building components. Those are real economic opportunities for us that address a lot of the sort of logistical hurdles that we're facing. But it also just in terms of how these buildings get built, and we've seen a lot of just innovations in terms of connecting components and how they get put together, how they might be able to get taken apart at the end of their life. Increasing spans and dealing with some of the structural issues that might impact programming inside the buildings. There's a lot of nuance around there that it seems really interesting and is moving really quickly.
Yeah, I'd like to talk to you after about the deconstruction. I think that's a really important opportunity with mass timber. Not too many people are thinking about it. There's currently a lot of discussion about what makes mass timber a more environmentally responsible and sustainable building material than other building materials. What's your take on that question?
Well, so it's sort of, that is probably the most complicated question because, like with all things around sustainability, it's so much about context. And so, one, what are we comparing it against? And if we're comparing it against, current business as usual structural components of concrete and steel, it's got a bunch of advantages that kind of jump off the page early. But there's always questions about the scalability. There's questions about which aspects of sustainability you're prioritizing. So carbon is a really strong one. Biodiversity is another issue that we have to be really mindful of and understanding the impacts on biodiversity. And then, from a systems level perspective, if we're shifting economies around timber harvesting for construction, what are the knock-on impacts of that, and how's that being addressed? Like, are we just increasing our amount of forestry across North America, the amount of trees we're cutting, the amount of landscapes we're disrupting? Is that really sustainable? And understanding what those impacts. So, in the short term, I think there's a lot of advantages. I think if you're really talking about how much we hope to scale up this industry, we have to address those bigger supply chain issues in really specific ways to make sure that there aren't unintended consequences about what that market, what that supply chain looks like.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And one of the contentious issues right now on sustainability is the characteristic of mass timber being a way of storing biogenic carbon, locking up carbon in mass timber. It seems to be a really hot topic right now, and in some circles is highly contested. What's your take on its place in the argument for using mass timber to lock up carbon?
Well, Um, yeah, this is very much a question that I don't have an answer for yet, and one that we're evaluating. And some of it will come out of sort of the consensus approach that industry takes. I mean, at the end of the day, we're going to have to report on carbon emissions, and we're going to rely on whatever industry standard is out there.
Right.
And that's just is sort of the business requirements that we have to follow. Um, you know, I think that um, I think that there's a risk when biogenic carbon is included that it can overstate the benefits because of the end of life issues. So that wood is being stored in that building in so long as that building is maintained and retained. And that's okay if you've got the mechanisms in place for end of life that address that carbon impact. So, you know, part of it, and this is maybe where the challenge is we're kind of punting that problem down the road, and hopefully
Right.
we'll have solutions for down the road. That's a leap of faith. It's so, do we know that there are going to be mechanisms that effectively would penalize the disposal of that wood material within a certain time period or end of life without processing that
To
material?
reduce the opportunity for it to
Yeah.
be turned into
Yeah.
CO2 or methane in
So
landfills.
if you had sort of certainty that there's going to be really strong carbon pricing on the back end around building demolition that would effectively present, that becomes their problem in the future. I'm not sure we have that right now. And so if you assume that it's really all about the upfront carbon, from a more conservative lens, we typically wouldn't count that right now.
I'm sort of hoping that even if you don't count it, others don't, that it gets bracketed as sort of a major footnote. Like, given that 1 cubic meter of wood stores 1 ton of CO2, I mean that's a big storage factor, and it would seem to be something that you'd at least want to keep there as if we could make sure that this building lasts for 100 years, this is what's also stored. So it's not lost because people can't agree on what it is. But anyway, I think that's, and you guys are going to have a real impact, right? Like how you account for that and tell the public that you're doing it will set the standard, because again, you're building a city up there.
Yeah, and there is something about climate forcing as well, which to get really sort of specific in the weeds, which is to say, an emission today is more damaging than an emission in the future.
Right.
And there's a gap in our financial analysis in the investment community. We have something called time value of money, or the net present value of capital, and which says, spending $1 tomorrow is cheaper than spending $1 today, which is the exact opposite of carbon. So, the idea that you take embodied carbon and you amortize that carbon over the life of the building every 50 years discounts the fact that that carbon was emitted today upfront,
right,
which has climate forcing impacts. So, a moderating factor or mechanism would be having a net present value of carbon, which would then take the sort of biogenic emissions and at least give you credit for the time period that those carbon emissions are stored, recognizing that that's valuable for avoiding climate tipping points in the short term.
That makes sense. The MTI and you guys should get together and do a paper. That's like next step.
There are smarter people on the embodied carbon side than I trying to figure out how you price upfront carbon emissions, especially when you think that carbon pricing is going up over time. So, your future operational carbon emissions may cost you, $200 a ton, $300 a ton, but those upfront emissions we're emitting today that we're going to amortize over 50 years aren't going to be, priced in that escalating way. Yeah.
I figure if we can't get our act together in the next 20 years, it's like game over anyway. So and that's why it's important. But speaking about economics, let's talk about the economics of mass timber, sort of the bigger picture. In most cities in Canada and the United States, mass timber is not currently considered the most economical building material. Why do you think this is, and what needs to be done to make it a more economical option?
Right. Well, I mean, I think it's still new. I think that's the biggest piece, and
Yeah.
you're getting into economies of scale, and recognizing. Yeah, I think first of all, look, what are you comparing it against, and for what components? And so the first piece is using the right materials in the right place. Um, when you're looking at it, though, I think that it's really an issue of how are we going to build up scale in the marketplace? How are we going to build up competition between suppliers, between trades, who could work on this, between design firms who are comfortable with it? We're still paying for a lot of learning curve. We're still paying for a lot of risk in the system. And so, how do we reduce the uncertainty or the risks around the technology is always key to getting things off the ground. And then, again, for us, a lot of our costs are going to be the time to build. The carrying cost of property, the faster we can build, the more it's worth. And so that constructability, and then obviously labor costs are going up. I mean, material costs have gone up, but labor costs continue to go up. So, with mass timber, if we can really figure out how to build more quickly, more, more, high quality components faster on site, I think there could be some real cost savings. It isn't, there's some innovation needed in how we procure materials. That's more of a product, a system. But that's sort of our long-term view is mass timber and other technologies moving towards modular prefabrication is probably necessary to hit the economies of scale and the process efficiencies that we need to see costs come down.
So, what are you guys doing right now to explore that? Are you running pro formas on it, like sort of analyzing different types of systems, or is it too early days to be doing that yet? Like, where are you in the sort of process of seeing mass timber as an important material to be deploying?
Yeah, so we are sort of, I would say, about to embark with our development partner. So we're partnering with another firm who's got a pretty exceptional track record in sustainable construction and experience with mass timber amongst other materials for our first district up at Downsview. And so we are about to embark on our analysis, and these are the kind of conversations that we're having about what these buildings are going to look like and what technologies we're going to use, aligning our sustainability goals with the programming of the whole first district. And so a big part of that discussion then is, what does that design process look like, and how do we evaluate the new technologies? And the challenge for us, I think, I mentioned sort of this changing the supply chain issue. And this is, if we're thinking about something like mass timber, and comparing it to wood, or sorry, to steel or concrete, the first challenge that the market has is when can you make that choice, because they're two different building types. So how far do you have to carry design along in two or three different pathways before you can pick a technology? That has a cost to carrying those designs forward and making that choice. So do you short circuit that, and do you start picking technologies up front and then just advancing those ones? That's a big question. And then the question is, with the supply chain that we have and the different suppliers and the different technologies, how much of the optimization of the technology is specific to a certain supplier? And so do you need to go out and identify the suppliers that you want to work with early in the process, bring them into the project much sooner than you otherwise would have, and then optimize your design around that
Their
supplier?
systems,
Or
yes.
do you design a system that's more generic, but can get you more competition through procurement at the end than you go out to tender? And that's just a pretty radical shift from the way we tend to procure material, which means really thinking about the whole development business model and what works. And then how do you pick the right partner? early in the design stage, and with with multiple entities who are partners in that, it's complicated. To leverage the scale of a site like ours, really there is advantages to having a replicable system that you do again and again and again, um, and just weighing sort of that, um, picking one system, hoping it's a winner, and repeating it versus having a more flexibility as the project progresses over time. A bigger pool of vendors. You got to weigh those two options. We're not quite there, but that'll be some of the exploration that we have.
Yeah. Are you doing sort of pros cons of the benefits of mass timber versus steel versus concrete that you mentioned? Like, for example, mass timber, really fast, quiet, less messy, those kind of things. Does it work financially, but also with those kind of qualitative characteristics as well right now, or is it again, is that coming?
Yeah, I mean that'll certainly come. I think on the design, on the construction management side, there will certainly be conversations about that around speed, feasibility. In my world around sort of responsible development, yeah, we certainly got some performance impact areas that we're looking at and baking in. So setting embodied carbon goals and targets. That's going to whittle down the available technologies that we pursue. We certainly have targets around waste. We have targets around, but we also have targets around quality of place. And one of our sort of pillars up at Downsview, and we have sort of 4 key responsible development pillars that we anchor our project on. And mass timber touches on a number of them, or it's supportive. So climate leadership is certainly one. We see on the embodied carbon side that it's strongly aligned with. City nature is another one, and it's really about integrating nature within the urban environment and benefiting from a lot of the performative aspects of natural materials, landscape systems, even the biophilic properties
aspects,
and wellness aspects of that, as well as sort of just general quality of place. So, we want a distinct identity for Downsview, beauty, quality of construction. These are all important metrics in how we measure responsible development. And so, those are going out there, and those will be part of our analysis as we get into detailed design.
So pulling out a bit, what are some of the most inspiring mass timber projects you're seeing out there as you look around Toronto and Canada?
I think it's there's a lot happening locally. There's a lot, it's a lot to look at that's been happening in BC, obviously in Toronto. I know you guys have worked on a couple. Centennial College, you've got a building going up. Lots of stuff happening down at the waterfront. I was on the Toronto Waterfront Design Review panel for a number of years. So we saw the Limberlock. Limberlost, as it was formerly called the Arbor. I still have that in my head, but down at George Brown College, the T3 project that's happening just down on the waterfront is a really, it's a beautiful commercial building down on the waterfront of Toronto. Obviously there's Liberty Village, 80 Atlantic. That was sort of one of the first that kind of got off the ground and got a lot of people really excited about these materials. So, I think just seeing them go up and the speed and starting to talk to people about what they liked about it and how the process works, that's mostly what's inspiring. That these are real projects, that have happened and are, continue to happen, and people are going back for more. So that's a good sign.
Yes, there's a real buzz in the air right now, at least among my client group, which is mostly colleges, universities, but also in the commercial, well, at least before the commercial market sort of eased off with the pandemic. But what are some of the interesting things that can be done with mass timber that would be possible, that wouldn't be, sorry, let me say that again. What are some of the interesting things that can be done with mass timber that would not have been possible with steel and concrete?
Well, I say well, that's maybe a tricky way of putting it. I would go back to aesthetically the unique principles of wood that is, maybe you could replicate with some, patterned prints in concrete, textures. Maybe you could print onto steel panel or metal panels. But that's again, that's the attraction of wood. One of the things that The beauty of wood, I think is being able to see it, and it's striking.
Yeah, it's biophilic nature.
We've got a couple interesting infrastructure projects as well. We're building a pedestrian cycling bridge across a railway corridor to connect the Downsview, the hangar district that we're building over into Downsview Park, which is
right.
This massive new urban park that you currently cannot get across. So that's going to be a huge connection point, and we want to carry the idea of the park and nature into the center of this new community. It's a big structural engineering process, is building a bridge. And having that exposed wood is something that would be really attractive to us, and that's not something we've necessarily we see as much as a default. But that's one area we're looking is how do you do wood in an exposed setting, keep it protected, but still give people
that's a real
that
challenge.
connection.
That's one of the big challenges with wood.
Yeah. So that's real. And then the other thing I'm sort of saying is not as where should mass timber be used, that it currently isn't be using. I'd almost flip it around though, because there's so much excitement about mass timber. It is a question, but where is the right place to use it? And so we're still seeing proposals for maybe like low-rise modular mass timber buildings, which just seems like overkill to me. So I think there's probably a sweet spot where mass timber is optimized in that mid-rise range when you get 6, 8, 10, maybe 12 stories. That's really optimized for. And I know there's a lot of work to go really tall in wood. If need be, I think selectively, that's where hybrid's going to be a necessity, and it's really where does mass timber add material value to this kind of projects. I think you can be more selective in how you use it in those settings. But I think there's sort of a lower threshold where it doesn't really make sense economically and environmentally. I mean, it's still a lot of wood, and there's a lot you can do with lightweight construction.
So looking out to the future, from your vantage point, what do you see being the most important opportunities for sustainable mass timber design construction down the road?
Yeah, we've talked a lot about modular and prefabrication and automated construction and what's going to be happening in that space, and I think that's really true. I would say not just specific to mass timber, but to building with wood and biomaterials, because I think that whole field has huge potential, and that means getting outside of structure. But it also helps the sustainability of mass timber, that if we're really looking at forestry where we are maximizing the utility of everything that we're harvesting. And so I want to see us returning to things like wood fiber insulation. I want to, we're looking at windows. Like what are the role? Like can we get away from things like aluminum framed windows by bringing wood components, wood composites into those sort of environments? And I think that by increasing the scope of what we can build using wood-based products and other biomaterials, then it helps address the overall sustainability of mass timber. So you're using what you can structurally, but then you're using byproducts in really productive ways as well. So I think we really need to figure out that if we're going to be cutting down trees, then we really need to maximize the utility and productivity of those lands that we do.
Yeah, that's a good point, and it sort of relates to an earlier point you made about hybridization. I think mass timber working together with steel and concrete technology has real potential in the future. Is it something that you folks are looking at as possibilities for taller buildings that wouldn't ordinarily be able to be simply mass timber right now? Is that hybrid structures something on the radar for you guys?
Yeah, I for sure will look at hybrid components, composite components, hybrid structures. I mean, the reality is, we're really interested in carbon. So I'm spending a lot of time tracking what's happening in the world of low carbon concrete as well. I think that's a huge opportunity area, and there's some really phenomenal technologies, and that's dealing with the cement side, dealing with the aggregate side as well. And so, I think, and in particular, we're always going to have a ton of subsurface infrastructure supporting these buildings, where, we're going to need materials like concrete and using a lot of those. And so, again, I think as we get we get a better palette of materials, a diversity of materials that we can use that are low carbon. We'll find really interesting ways for them to work together and optimized around the properties of those specific materials. And even in the buildings where we're thinking about entirely concrete design, understand the performance differences between, say, columns and slabs, and how could you change mixtures to reduce carbon based on the different properties that you need in terms of strength and curing time. There's a lot of opportunity if we're more specific and more precise in our applications. And I think it's the same thing with wood. It just adds, it's adding another material to your palette, and then figuring out how to work that into a construction schedule and into procurement. But that will deliver a much lower impact building on the whole, if you can be much more precise.
Yeah, and in fact, one of the most exciting things that's happened as a knock-on effect of mass timber becoming so popular in the last decade is that the steel industry has had to step up. And so now you've got companies like New Steel in the States that use renewable energy arc forges to create steel. So they have zero carbon steel. And the concrete industry is scrambling to lower their concrete or CO2 footprint. So, I mean, it really has altogether created a much better dynamic. Where does mass timber fit into playing a key part in building more sustainable, affordable housing in Canada in the bigger picture to address current housing crisis? You guys are playing a big role in this as leaders because of, you're building a city up there. Any thoughts on the role in the housing crisis right now?
Well, again, with affordability, the biggest, I guess there's maybe three main issues that we see. I mean, we're a developer, but you need supply, so you got to be getting more product out there more efficiently, which means using land more efficiency, which means density. And typically the density that I think is probably the most economical to build is in that mid-rise range. Take out sort of the, in an ideal world, we should be able to turn out 8 to 10 story buildings pretty quickly everywhere citywide. And there's been a lot of work around zoning reform, more permissive zoning to allow more mid-rise and missing middle buildings. So if you see that typology, it's really well suited to mass timber. So I think that's just really compatible with the overall supply narrative. And then just from a cost perspective, it's really speed. And that's sort of the modularity of wood construction, the speed of construction, the workability. If you can start building quicker, turning out more units, that's going to bring costs down. It's going to help increase supply. It's going to make it more attractive. So I think, there's a number of groups that we're following in Toronto who are really focused on modular affordable housing. There's a lot of conversations around modular affordable housing. And I think all of those conversations are just really compatible with what I think the mass timber industry is positioned to deliver. And I expect that'll be a big part of the synergy there.
Thanks, Jeff. And as a segue to wrap up, well, we have a wrap up question. And that is, are there any articles, websites, or books related to mass timber you'd like to recommend to listeners? And we'll put the links in the show notes.
Sure. Well, listen, there's a lot of stuff out there. I don't think, compared to you, Craig, I know you've always tearing through one book or another. And I'll flag some maybe other media sources that I've thought were really compelling. First of all, I just maybe call it the industry in Canada and the advocacy work that they've been doing around wood, which I think is really great. One read that I always actually really like and pay attention to, Canada Wood Council.
Yes,
puts out their wood design awards. Yeah. They're just great publications. They're beautiful. I mean, it's hard not to fall for the sort of aesthetics that they're putting forth.
And they do a great job of compiling them too. They're really
those are really nice projects and great to see Canadian design. Two things that have recently I've been thinking about a lot. The recent TED Talk by Michael Green. He's a great Canadian architect and a real leader in the wood space, who's kind of pushing the envelope and is thinking about wood as a construction material, maybe a little bit more future oriented. So he had a TED Talk recently, and it was called the The Natural Building Blocks of Sustainable Architecture, which is a really interesting watch, and sort of thinks a lot about the properties of wood, the inherent sort of structural, performance
The
properties
nature of
of
wood itself,
wood, the shape,
cellulose.
yeah,
Yeah.
and the components of that and how it works, and thinking more about, can building design reflect those properties and those principles, which is, means slightly more organic shapes, but really optimized. It's a really interesting think piece, and then that gets me thinking about how we might be producing wood-like components in the future using advanced biomaterials. That's really cool. And then the other piece, and we sort of talked about this right at the start, the attraction of wood. Probably just because I've been thinking a lot about it, is this idea of biophilic design in cities. Um, because I think, maybe I get a little overwhelmed with our conversations of like technology and, density. We need so much density. Like, I think we got to retain the humanity and the beauty, and sort of wellness in urban design. And so if you haven't yet, I'll always point people to the 14 Patterns of Biophilic Design.
Yes.
You
Yes.
can go
That's
read
good. Yeah.
by Bill Branning and the group over at Terrabin, because it just sort of re-triggers, it's not, biophilic design isn't just about planting a bunch of green stuff in cities. It's about really understanding, the human connection to nature, the visual cues, but also the patterns and the shapes of the spaces that we occupy and how that works. And so, I think understanding that and reflecting on that and really recognize that there's real sort of material performative benefits to natural patterns in urban contexts, I think is really important. And you'll probably get lots of thoughts about the role that wood could play in that space.
That's a great reference. He's such a decent guy, and his research is so thoughtful, and he's been at it for like 20 years. It's just so thoughtful. We should get him and interview him. Anyway, that's really great. Thank you very much, Jeff. That was a real pleasure to interview you, and good luck with all of the things you're going to be doing at Northcrest. It's a really, really cool project up there, and it will have such an important positive impact on the city. Thanks very much.
Yeah, always great to have a conversation with you.
Cheers.
All right.
That's it. That's good. That was fun.
It's quick, eh? Like